It was November 24th, 1944. From the airfields of North Field on Tinian and Isley Field on Saipan, the 21st Bomber Command sent 111 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses roaring toward Japan. From his headquarters on Guam, Brigadier General Haywood Hansell oversaw the massive American strategic bombing force. Those gleaming silver bombers carried 277 tons of explosives. Their target, the Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashino engine plant, sitting on the outskirts of Tokyo. What the Japanese fighter pilots were about to encounter that morning would completely upend everything they thought they knew about aerial warfare. It would expose a technological gap so wide that no amount of skill, bravery, or determination could hope to close it. Captain Tatsuo Yamada adjusted his oxygen mask inside the cramped cockpit of his Kawasaki Ki-61 High-End at Chofu Airfield, just outside Tokyo. That morning's briefing had hammered home one key point: intercept the enemy bombers from as high above as possible. Recent intelligence reports spoke of massive four-engine bombers flying out of newly captured bases in the Mariana Islands, operating at heights no Japanese pilot had ever seen before. Despite the risks, Yamada volunteered for the high-altitude interception mission, one that promised a brutal fight against an enemy whose true capabilities remained a mystery. His High-End was armed with 4 12.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons, weapons designed for dogfights at normal altitudes, the kind of battles where Japanese fighters had long held the advantage. But this mission was different. The challenge came from Japan's lack of experience against American heavy bombers. Back in early 1944, they'd only faced B-24 Liberators and older B-17 Flying Fortresses over China, both of which typically flew between 20,000 and 25,000 feet, altitudes the Japanese could reach. Major Teishi Maeda had developed a special tactic during those encounters, focusing on climbing before engagement rather than during it. A pilot who reached altitude first had the energy advantage, often enough to offset the bomber's armor and defensive guns. But this morning's reports hinted that the new B-29s were flying far higher than any enemy aircraft they'd ever faced. The 21st Bomber Command represented the most formidable American air power deployed in the Pacific since the Doolittle raid back in 1942. In time, the command would grow to over 1,000 aircraft spread across 5 massive airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Each B-29 had something revolutionary: a pressurized cabin designed specifically for ultra-high altitude operations across the endless Pacific. This was a completely different approach from earlier bombers like the B-17 and B-24, whose crews had to endure unpressurized cabins, heavy flight suits, and oxygen masks just to survive above 25,000 feet. For the B-29, American engineers had accepted added complexity in exchange for safety and superiority. Its pressurization system allowed crews to fly in comfort, sometimes in just their shirt sleeves, even at heights that would leave any unpressurized crew gasping from the cold and lack of oxygen. Meanwhile, Yamada's group, a mix of Ki-61 Heian fighters from the 244th Sentai and Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki interceptors from the 47th, scrambled from multiple airfields around Tokyo, climbing as hard as their engines would allow. Far above them, white trails etched across the sky, contrails at extreme altitudes, marked where the American bombers were already approaching from the southeast. At the Chiba radar station, operators tracked the massive formation flying between 27,000 and 31,000 feet, higher than any Japanese aircraft had ever dared to fight. As the American bombers pushed through shifting weather layers, their altitude varied, forcing Japanese ground controllers to frantically guide interceptors toward the incoming threat. But no matter how hard they climbed, most fighters struggled to even reach 25,000 feet before the bombers appeared overhead. The technological gap became obvious the moment the two sides came into range. I was flying an aircraft that had been designed back in 1941, the Kawasaki Ki-61 High-End, built for mid-altitude dogfights against Chinese and early Pacific War opponents. My plane weighed about 7,600 pounds and was powered by a 1,175 horsepower Kawasaki Hey 40 liquid-cooled engine. giving it a top speed of around 368 miles an hour at 16,000 feet. On paper, the high-end could reach 36,000 feet, but in reality, the engine's power dropped sharply past 28,000. Up there, the thin air robbed the propeller of bite. The controls turned sluggish, and every movement felt delayed. The self-sealing fuel tanks and pilot armor we'd added after earlier battles only made things worse, adding weight that ate away at what little performance we had left. Nearby, the Ki-44 Shoki interceptors from the 47th Sentai were trying to claw their way up too. Those fighters were built specifically for high-altitude interceptions, but even they were gasping for air. Their engines overheated, producing only a fraction of their normal power, and the pilots fought to breathe through oxygen systems never meant for long fights at such thin altitudes. A few managed to touch 28,000 feet, but most began stalling before they could close in on the bombers flying thousands of feet higher. Even the lucky ones who did get close enough to engage found themselves out of energy almost immediately. The controls barely responded, and the engines screamed past their limits. Meanwhile, the B-29s above us flew in perfect formation, steady and unbothered, their crews sealed inside warm, pressurized cabins. They didn't need the heavy suits or awkward oxygen masks that had weighed down the crews of earlier bombers. Up front, Captain Robert Morgan commanded the lead Superfortress, Dauntless Dottie. His navigator, Captain Theodore Van Kirk, peered through the Norden bomb sight to line up the target. Each of the bomber's 4 Wright R-3350 engines pumped out a staggering 2,200 horsepower, keeping the giant aircraft cruising at over 300 miles per hour, even in the thin air. Turbo-superchargers did the impossible, compressing the air so the engines could keep their full power where any normal engine would choke. Inside, a narrow tunnel ran over the bomb bays, connecting the forward and rear pressurized sections, letting crew members move freely without heavy suits. It was an incredible machine, one that could fight and fly higher than anything we had. Even its defensive systems were advanced. A central fire control network used analog computers to track multiple targets at once, letting the gunners sit comfortably behind their sights as the system handled most of the work. I pushed my high-end as high as it would go. The airspeed indicator hovered just above 180 miles an hour as the plane shuddered, barely holding 30,000 feet. My pre-war training had never prepared me for combat at this height. We'd been taught to dive from above, keeping our energy advantage, but getting above those bombers simply wasn't possible. Our old tactics, developed against unescorted B-17s and B-24s at moderate altitudes, suddenly felt useless. I could only hold 30,000 feet for a few seconds before the engine started to die, forcing me into a recovery dive that cost 3,000 feet each time. Every climb ended the same way. Red line engine temperatures, fluctuating oil pressure, and the sickening feeling of helplessness. Through my canopy, I could see the bombers' white contrails stretching overhead. Their defensive guns tracked me, but they didn't fire. I was still far too low to reach them. No matter how hard we tried, we simply couldn't bridge the distance. That morning, only about 40 Japanese fighters managed to even get close enough to fire at the formation. Most of us made a single pass before running out of speed and altitude. In the thin air, our machine gun rounds lost velocity fast. Many never even reached their targets. The few who did line up a good shot had barely enough time for a short burst before their planes stalled and peeled away. Even the anti-aircraft guns on the ground couldn't help us. Their shells burst thousands of feet below the bombers, despite the gunners setting them to their maximum elevation. Technically, our largest guns could reach 30,000 feet, but accuracy at that height was almost non-existent. That day, November 24th, 1944, marked the first full-scale B-29 raid on Tokyo since the symbolic Doolittle raid more than 2.5 years earlier. The massive formation pressed on, straight toward the Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashino engine plant, Japan's most vital aircraft engine factory. At the lead of the group, Chief Bombardier Lieutenant Coleman released his bombs right on cue, and one by one, the others followed. each dropping their loads from slightly different altitudes as the sky over Tokyo filled with the distant shimmer of falling steel. At those incredible heights, the bombers encountered powerful jet stream winds, something no one had really understood before. Up there, the air current screamed along at over 200 miles an hour. Because of those winds, only 24 of the bombers actually hit the main target. The rest either dropped on secondary sites or missed altogether. Still, the psychological effect was enormous. The bombs came falling out of the sky from a height no one had imagined possible. Down below, our fighters circled helplessly, unable to climb anywhere near the attackers. On the ground, people stared up at the thin white lines crossing the blue sky above Tokyo, contrails drawn at altitudes so high they seemed beyond human reach. Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka was at sector control that morning, trying to coordinate what was left of our defense. His radio crackled non-stop with frustrated voices from pilots who reported engines quitting, controls freezing, and a complete inability to reach the altitudes needed for interception. The American formation sailed straight through our airspace, almost untouched. Only one bomber was lost, and that was due to a Japanese pilot who, out of sheer desperation, rammed his damaged plane into it in a suicidal attempt to bring one down. Most of us burned through our fuel just trying to climb, forced to turn back to base without ever firing a single shot. The sight of those silver bombers cruising far above our reach was a shock. To the pilots, to the generals, to the entire military command. The 21st Bomber Command completed its first mission over Tokyo with barely a scratch from Japanese defenses. A few B-29s had to ditch in the Pacific because of mechanical issues, but not one fell to our guns. Our fighters managed to claim just one victory, again, through ramming, while the bomber crews reported shooting down 5 of our planes. It was a brutal demonstration of technological superiority, one that turned everything we thought we knew about air combat on its head. That altitude sanctuary, as we came to call it, went against every expectation we'd built from our experience fighting B-17s and B-24s over China. We had completely misunderstood the American bomber's true capabilities, and the revolutionary design of the B-29 made sure of it. From his desk at Naval Headquarters, Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda watched reports of the B-29's performance roll in. He studied the failures of our Army's fighter defenses with growing alarm. His intelligence assessments made one thing clear: these bombers were flying higher than anything Japan could touch. Even the Navy's newest fighters were useless at those altitudes. The implications were terrifying. Japan would need entirely new aircraft designs or some completely different method of defense to counter the threat. But by late 1944, the country simply didn't have the time or the resources to make that happen. Our intelligence had underestimated just how advanced American technology had become. We hadn't grasped the significance of their pressurized cabins or turbo-supercharged engines, innovations that made high-altitude flight not only possible but routine. Our entire defensive strategy was built on the assumption that enemy bombers would fly below 25,000 feet, just like they always had. That assumption was fatal. The concept of a pressurized cabin was so new and so poorly understood that our analysts failed to recognize what it truly meant for combat operations. Before the B-29, American bombers operating from China had always flown within our reach. That pattern had lulled us into complacency. We believed we'd seen the limits of their technology. We hadn't. Then came December 3rd, 1944. 86 B-29s returned to Tokyo, once again targeting the Musashino engine plant. This time, our response was different. We'd learned from the November disaster, or so we hoped. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi of the elite 244th Sentai introduced new tactics. He had his fighters climb to their absolute ceiling before the bombers arrived, aiming to dive down on them from above, using gravity for an energy advantage. It was a smart plan, the kind of adjustment born from bitter experience. But even starting from the best possible position, our Ki-61s still couldn't reach the bombers' altitude. We even tried using stripped-down interceptors, aircraft with the armor removed, radios pulled out, and just enough ammunition to make a few passes. The lighter planes could climb a little higher, but not high enough. They clawed their way skyward, engines screaming, only to fall short once again. The bombers remained safely out of reach, their formation drifting calmly through the sky while we fought against gravity and the limits of our machines. Lieutenant Saburo Hayashi led a unit unlike any other, a ramming squadron called Hagakure Tai, made up entirely of volunteers who were prepared to die. These were men who had accepted that their mission would be one way. Their aircraft were stripped of everything non-essential, most of their guns, all their armor, and even the radio equipment. Each fighter carried just enough fuel to reach the bombers and attempt a final, fatal strike. Their Ki-61s climbed toward the oncoming American formation, engines screaming at full throttle with emergency boost engaged. Everyone knew what that meant. The engines would be ruined before the mission was over. The manifold pressures went beyond factory limits, and the cylinder heads ran hot enough to risk melting. Before takeoff, the pilots sat breathing pure oxygen for half an hour to prepare their bodies for the thin air above. But even that wasn't enough. Their oxygen systems weren't built for such heights, and many began to feel dizzy and lightheaded long before they reached their targets. Most of the fighters stalled out around 30,000 feet, still too low to reach the B-29s. But Sergeant Masayuki Itaki, flying one of the lightened Ki-61s, managed to claw his way up to 31,500 feet. There he spotted a straggling superfortress that had fallen slightly behind formation. He pushed his nose up in a desperate zoom climb, aiming his entire aircraft like a spear. The bomber's 50 caliber guns opened fire immediately, flashing through the cold blue sky. Bullets tore into his wings and fuselage, but Itaki didn't turn away. He held his line, closing the distance inch by inch. Then, just 500 feet short of impact, his fighter ran out of energy. The plane stalled violently, rolling onto its back before spinning out of control. Somehow, Itaki managed to recover at 20,000 feet, but the Hien was crippled, leaking fuel, and his engine nearly dead. He had no choice but to turn back. The ramming attacks occasionally scored a victory when a damaged bomber was forced to descend, but they were rare, isolated moments in a losing fight. Against the high-altitude threat of the B-29, those desperate tactics were like throwing pebbles at thunder. By the end of December 1944, Japan's cities had begun to feel the weight of strategic bombing. B-29 losses were almost non-existent, while our defenses crumbled with each raid. For the pilots, it was soul-crushing. We could see the smoke rising from our homeland and yet remain powerless to stop it. The old ideals of the samurai, courage, honor, sacrifice, meant nothing in the face of such technology. You could have all the spirit in the world, but it didn't matter when your aircraft simply couldn't reach the fight. Many of us were ready to give our lives for Japan, but what haunted us was the helplessness, the shame of watching our country burn, while knowing we couldn't even touch the enemy. Then, in January of 1945, everything changed again. Major General Curtis LeMay took command of the 21st Bomber Command, bringing with him a new, ruthless philosophy of air warfare, one that would soon turn the skies over Japan into something even more devastating. I remember how obsessed I was with figuring out why our high-altitude daylight raids weren't working the way we'd hoped. From the start, the results were disappointing. Our bombing accuracy was terrible, and we eventually found out why. Powerful jet streamlines up there were tossing us around like leaves in a storm. At those altitudes, the winds could hit more than 250 miles an hour, something we hadn't even known existed before the B-29 started flying missions. Those winds would push our bombers across the target area so fast that hitting anything with precision became almost impossible. Navigation was a nightmare, and no matter how skilled the bombardier was, the bombs often drifted miles off course. During the winter, the clouds didn't help either. Most of the time, we couldn't even see what we were supposed to hit. We had to rely on radar bombing, which was nowhere near as accurate. All told, less than 10% of our bombs landed anywhere close to where they were meant to. The folks back in Washington started breathing down our necks, demanding better results. After studying the situation carefully, General LeMay made a bold move in March of '45. He ordered us to switch tactics. Instead of flying those high-altitude daylight raids, we'd go low and hit Japan's cities at night with incendiaries. That decision changed everything about the air war. We stripped the B-29s of almost all their defensive guns except the tail turrets and loaded them to the brim with firebombs. Dropping from 30,000 feet to somewhere between 5,000 and 9,000 eliminated the jet stream problem, but it also put us squarely within range of Japan's air defenses. Suddenly, their fighters could finally reach us, which completely changed the way the battles played out. Then came March 9th, 1945, the night of Operation Meeting House, the firebombing of Tokyo. It was one of the most devastating raids in history and ended up rewriting the book on strategic bombing. A total of 334 B-29s went in that night, flying low, around 5,000 to 9,000 feet. Finally, at altitudes every Japanese fighter could reach. The sudden switch to night attacks threw their defenses into confusion. Lieutenant Yoshio Mitsuyoshi scrambled his Nakajima Ki-44 from Matsudo Airfield that night, and for the first time, he didn't have to struggle to reach our altitude. But fighting in the dark was a whole different kind of war. Without airborne radar or good ground control, Japanese pilots had a hard time even finding us. Spotlights would catch a bomber here or there, and anti-aircraft gunners fired point-blank for the first time. Their Ki-44s and Ki-61s launched desperate solo attacks. No coordination, no radio chatter, just lone fighters charging into the fire. Mitsuyoshi himself made several passes on our bombers and saw hits on engines and fuselages. A few of our planes went down, trailing flames, but most kept right on flying through the chaos. The B-29s were tough, unbelievably tough. Even when shot full of holes, they just kept pressing on toward their targets. Our remote-controlled turrets proved their worth that night. Guided by radar, they opened up on attackers even in total darkness. Japanese pilots, used to daytime fighting, struggled badly to adapt. And then the firestorm hit. 16 square miles of Tokyo burned, and about 100,000 people died. It was the deadliest air raid in human history. The Japanese claimed they shot down 14 of our bombers, their best count of the war, but they couldn't stop the destruction. Flying low helped them intercept us, but the sheer number of bombers, the confusion of night, and the surprise of our new tactics made their defense almost useless. The firebombing success proved LeMay had been right. His gamble worked, and it became the blueprint for all the raids that followed. Overnight, Japan's entire high-altitude defense strategy was worthless. Their engineers had been pouring resources into developing engines and pressurized cockpits for interceptors that could reach our old cruising altitudes. Now, all of that effort meant nothing. I remember hearing about Lieutenant Sadamu Kumachi from the Imperial Navy. He flew the new Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden during the B-29 attacks over Nagoya in early 1945. That plane had a supercharged engine that could take it up to 36,000 feet, at least on paper, enough to meet us head-on. But in practice, those high-altitude fights were a nightmare. Even when the Raiden managed to reach bomber height, the thin air made it nearly uncontrollable. The controls stiffened up, the engines barely produced power, and the pilots couldn't hold their aim. They said you had to be perfectly positioned before the bombers even arrived to get off a decent shot, because once we passed overhead, you couldn't climb after us anymore. When the bombers passed overhead, a lot of Japanese pilots found themselves in real trouble. Their oxygen systems often failed, and many ended up dizzy or even passed out entirely at those altitudes. The few interceptions that actually succeeded usually came when they managed to catch a damaged B-29 that had dropped out of formation, not when they tried to attack the main group still flying high and tight. By April 1945, the Japanese had grown desperate. They started organizing coordinated kamikaze attacks specifically aimed at the B-29 formations. Conventional interception just wasn't cutting it anymore, so they formally created special attack units. Suicide squads designed to take out the superfortresses by ramming them head-on. One of the first successful missions happened on April 12th, when Corporal Koshi Ogawa deliberately rammed his plane into the B-29 Torigai over Kawasaki. Both aircraft were destroyed in the collision. That same day, something incredible happened on our side too. One of the most heroic acts in all of B-29 operations. Staff Sergeant Henry "Red" Irwin earned the Medal of Honor after a phosphorus flare went off prematurely inside his bomber. The flare exploded right in his face, burning through his nose and blinding him instantly. Somehow, through unimaginable pain, Irwin grabbed that burning canister, still spewing molten phosphorus, and carried it the length of the aircraft to throw it out the cockpit window. He saved every man aboard, 11 crew members in all, at the cost of his own body. His courage became a symbol of the kind of bravery both sides showed during those brutal months, even when technology and odds were uneven. Across Japan, more of those special attack units were forming. Pilots volunteered for missions they knew would end in death. Their sole purpose was to crash directly into our silver bombers. These suicide ramming attacks destroyed maybe 10 B-29s in total during the entire war, barely a dent in the overall bomber force. Still, for us flying those missions, the idea that someone was willing to sacrifice himself just to take you out was deeply unsettling. The psychological impact far outweighed the actual damage. Even when they managed to hit one of us, it didn't change much about the bombing campaign's effectiveness. The B-29's central fire control system gave us a huge defensive edge. Despite having fewer gun positions than the older B-17s, our computer-controlled turrets could track multiple targets at once, and our gunners worked from inside pressurized compartments instead of freezing in open-air positions. Japanese pilots said they'd never faced defensive fire so accurate. The automated system kept tracking them even as we weaved and turned. And because the guns were remotely controlled, the system could keep firing even if one section took a hit. On the older bombers, if a gunner went down, that whole area was defenseless. Not with the B-29. Combined with our ability to fly higher than almost anything they had, this technology made our bombers incredibly hard to stop. Then came another turning point. In April 45, the P-51 Mustangs started arriving from Iwo Jima. Those long-range escorts changed everything again. With them in the skies, we gained total air superiority over Japan. Suddenly, our daylight raids were a lot safer. Now the Japanese interceptors had to fight their way through swarms of aggressive Mustang pilots just to get close to us. And if they did manage to break through, the Mustangs were right on their tails the moment they tried to line up for a shot. I remember hearing about Captain Yasuhiko Kuro, who led the 64th Sentai, a unit flying the new Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, Japan's most advanced operational fighter. It was a capable aircraft, with a service ceiling of about 34,000 feet under perfect conditions. With a light load, less fuel, fewer guns, they could push it up to around 32,000, though most pilots said it only handled decently up to about 28,000 before the power dropped off sharply. Its He-45 engine packed a good punch at mid-level altitudes, but it just couldn't breathe up high. The supercharger wasn't strong enough for the thin air. Because of that, their Ki-84s started focusing on intercepting our lower-altitude mining missions over the water, the only time we were close enough for them to have a fighting chance. I remember those early victories we scored against enemy bombers flying below 20,000 feet. Those moments proved what our fighters could really do once the altitude disadvantage was taken out of the equation. Still, when it came to high-altitude daylight raids, those missions were practically untouchable, even after we made several key improvements to the Ki-84. That performance gap lingered right through the rest of the war. Most of our Ki-84 sorties couldn't even climb high enough to meet the enemy in combat. Then, around June of 1945, the Kawasaki Ki-100 entered the scene. Basically a Ki-61 airframe fitted with a radial engine instead of the troublesome, liquid-cooled one. The change worked wonders for reliability, but it came at a cost. The new setup just couldn't match the altitude performance of the older inline engines. At medium altitudes, though, those Ki-100s were a dream to fly. They handled beautifully, danced through the air, and could hold their own against American fighters. Pilots loved them for their maneuverability, even if the radial engine capped their ceiling at about 32,000 feet. We all agreed the handling was first-rate, but it still wasn't enough to chase down a B-29 cruising high above us. In truth, the Ki-100 was probably the finest operational fighter Japan ever produced, but it showed up too late and in too few numbers to make a real difference. Throughout 1945, Japanese engineers kept churning out new prototypes for high-altitude interceptors. The Mitsubishi Ki-83 twin-engine fighter looked promising, especially with its turbo-supercharged engines meant for extreme altitudes. The Kawasaki Ki-102 was another heavy fighter, packed with firepower specifically designed to take down bombers. Unfortunately, the factories just couldn't keep up. Material shortages were crippling. They couldn't get enough high-grade aluminum or the special alloys needed for those advanced superchargers. Production delays dragged on, and before any of these new designs could reach combat, most of the prototypes were wiped out in Allied bombing raids. Those B-29 attacks didn't just destroy aircraft. They systematically leveled the very factories and engine plants we depended on. When the Akashi engine works burned down in January 1945, the place that built the Ha-40 engines for the Ki-61, it was like losing the heart of our air power. Month after month, the technological gap only grew wider. The Americans kept improving their machines while Japanese industry was crumbling piece by piece. Each passing week brought a stronger, more capable B-29, while our own development ground to a halt. Then came Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets, leading a special crew trained for something new, the atomic bomb mission. His team flew modified silver plate B-29s, stripped of almost all defensive guns except the tail turret. That made the planes lighter, faster, and able to fly even higher than before. At those altitudes, they were completely out of reach. And on August 6, 1945, that altitude advantage proved absolute. When the Enola Gay approached Hiroshima at around 31,600 feet, our fighters scrambled from nearby airfields, desperate to intercept. Lieutenant Matsuo Yasui, flying his Ki-61, climbed as hard as he could. His engine strained, his gauges redlined, and he managed to reach 29,000 feet before the plane stalled, still 2,000 feet short of the target. The rest didn't fare any better. Most couldn't even break 27,000 despite the clear skies. Moments later, the atomic blast lit up the horizon while those pilots circled helplessly below, powerless to stop it, or even to fully understand what had just happened. We didn't understand the full nature of that new weapon at first, not until a few days later, on August 9th, when the Boxcar dropped the second atomic bomb over Nagasaki. Japanese radar tracked the plane all the way in, giving plenty of warning for an interception. Squadrons scrambled into the air, engines roaring. But it didn't matter. None of our fighters could climb high enough to reach the B-29 cruising at 28,000 feet. That altitude gap became a kind of sanctuary for the Americans, a place we simply couldn't touch. It gave them the freedom to use their most devastating weapons without fear of interference. After the war, when the analysts went over the data, the extent of our disadvantage became painfully clear. The B-29 wasn't just another bomber. It represented an entire generation of technology we didn't have. Its pressurized cabin allowed American crews to operate comfortably at altitudes where our pilots were barely able to breathe. Their turbo-supercharged engines kept full power even in the thin air, while ours sputtered and produced less than half their rated output. All those small advantages, better engines, pressurization, materials, they added up. And, in the end, they were decisive. I'll say this much. Our pilots were brave beyond measure. Time and again they climbed into the sky knowing they were flying machines outmatched in every way. Their skill and courage never wavered, but courage alone can't close a technological gap that wide. High-altitude combat demanded an engineering sophistication our wartime industry just couldn't deliver. The shortages were relentless, especially when it came to special steels and aluminum alloys. Without them, developing turbo-superchargers or durable high-performance engines was nearly impossible. The Americans, on the other hand, had both the resources and the time to perfect their systems. The B-29 campaign proved that investment in technology and industrial power could be just as decisive as any battle fought in the air. Their entire strategy hinged on one thing: altitude. They operated from a sanctuary no Japanese pilot could reach, and that advantage made strategic bombing devastatingly effective. All the bravery and ingenuity in the world couldn't change that. Our defensive failures drove home a bitter lesson. In modern warfare, matching the enemy's technology is every bit as important as matching their will to fight. That lesson didn't end with the war either. It shaped how every nation approached aviation development afterward, setting priorities that still influence military design today. By the final days, General Kurachika Anami was forced to face that truth head-on. In those last military conferences before Japan's surrender, he reviewed our home defense efforts and saw what we all knew by then. The B-29's altitude advantage had wiped away every edge we thought we had: our geography, our tactics, even our fighting spirit. No amount of courage or creativity could make up for that kind of technical inferiority. And when that realization finally set in, it made accepting unconditional surrender not just a political choice, but a recognition of complete technological defeat. Once it became clear that we couldn't defend against the B-29s, continuing the fight felt almost meaningless. Even some of the pilots admitted that. Lieutenant Naoshi Kano, who flew the old Ki-61, later wrote about those final, desperate interception attempts in his memoirs. He described how they'd climb with everything those engines had, watching the temperature gauges creep into the red. His flight leader's engine caught fire around 28,000 feet, forcing him to bail out. Kano kept pushing, clawing upward until he reached maybe 30,000 feet. But by then, his controls had gone soft, and the plane wouldn't respond. Above him, the B-29s glided past like silver ghosts, completely untouchable. He said the worst part wasn't fear. It was the shame. The shame of watching your homeland burn from below, knowing you couldn't protect it no matter how hard you tried. That helplessness stayed with them long after the war ended. From the American side, Technical Sergeant Robert Johnson, a B-29 crewman, recalled what it looked like from his central fire control station. He said they'd watched the Japanese fighters struggling upward, tiny specks growing slowly larger. Sometimes they got close enough for the crews to see the red circles on their wings, even the glint of sunlight off the canopy. Then the fighters would stall out, spin over, and tumble away like autumn leaves in the wind. A few made it close enough to fire, but their shots almost always fell short. It was almost sad, Johnson admitted. They tried so hard, but we had every advantage: altitude, speed, firepower, armor. And all they had was courage. And courage just isn't enough to beat physics. Those lessons weren't forgotten. After the war, Strategic Air Command built its entire Cold War doctrine around what the B-29 campaign had proven: that high-altitude penetration was the key to delivering nuclear weapons over defended territory. The technology behind those missions, pressurization, supercharging, and high-altitude performance, advanced rapidly after the war, directly informed by the combat experience over Japan. The success of those high-flying bombers influenced decades of aircraft design, leading to the jet-powered strategic bombers that would later soar even higher and faster than the B-29 ever could. After Japan's surrender, engineers studied captured B-29s and their technical documents in detail. What they found was sobering. The Americans were several generations ahead in aircraft design philosophy. The B-29's pressurization system, for instance, involved complex sealing mechanisms and reinforced structures that Japan simply couldn't manufacture during the war. Its turbo-superchargers demanded precision engineering and high-grade materials, things in short supply or completely unavailable in wartime Japan. Even the remote-controlled defensive turrets were marvels of engineering, running on analog computers packed with vacuum tubes and tiny precision components the Japanese industry had no means to reproduce. The post-war analysis painted a clear picture. Japan's industrial base was nowhere near ready to compete in modern aviation. The gap wasn't just about tactics. It was about engineering, materials, and manufacturing sophistication on a completely different scale. Colonel Paul Tibbets, the B-29 pilot who led the atomic missions, reflected on that advantage later in life. He said that flying above enemy reach allowed his crews to focus entirely on navigation and accuracy, without worrying about defense. "We knew the Japanese fighters couldn't touch us," he said. "They could see us, they could track us on radar. But that was it. It felt like flying behind bulletproof glass. That altitude, that sanctuary, guaranteed mission success." On the other side of that equation was Captain Iwa Hayashi, a Ki-84 pilot who tried to intercept B-29s during the war's final months. Even in Japan's most advanced fighter, he said, getting high enough to meet the bombers was almost impossible. Above 30,000 feet, his engine sputtered and coughed, barely producing enough power to keep him level. The controls went slack, like flying through molasses, he recalled. If he was lucky, he might make a single pass and fire off a short burst before stalling out completely. Watching the bombers fly on unharmed while the cities below burned left a kind of helplessness that never faded. When engineers later examined downed B-29 wrecks, the sophistication of their design became even clearer. The pressurized compartments used advanced sealing systems made from synthetic rubber compounds, materials that Japan had never been able to produce. Every detail spoke of an industrial and technological world far beyond what we'd been capable of during the war. The more engineers studied the B-29's construction, the more they realized how far behind Japan really was. Even the structural reinforcements needed to pressurize the bomber's cabin required precision welding and quality control that were simply beyond Japanese manufacturing standards at the time. The B-29's remote-controlled gun turrets were another shock. Those systems relied on analog computers powered by vacuum tubes, far more advanced than anything the Japanese military had ever fielded. The servo mechanisms that aimed and stabilized those guns demanded a level of precision machining and electrical engineering that Japan's wartime factories couldn't come close to replicating. Even the smallest things, the wiring, the insulation, the materials used in the circuits, were of noticeably higher quality than anything Japan could produce during the war. Every inch of that aircraft reflected an industrial sophistication that was worlds apart. Major Toshio Sakagawa, who commanded the 244th Sentai during the height of the B-29 offensive, later reflected on those bitter experiences. "My pilots were some of the best Japan had," he wrote, "men with years of combat experience and incredible skill, yet we accomplished virtually nothing against the B-29s at altitude." Their combat reports told the same story again and again. Desperate climbs into thin air, engines overheating, controls going sluggish. They'd reach 28, maybe 29,000 feet, only to watch the bombers sail past, calm and untouchable. It was a technological defeat, Sakagawa admitted. Complete and humiliating. From the American side, Lieutenant Marcus McDilder, a B-29 bombardier flying missions over Osaka, described what those encounters looked like from above. "The Japanese pilots were unbelievably determined," he said. "We'd see them clawing their way up toward us for 15-20 minutes straight. Sometimes they'd trade speed for altitude, pulling zoom climbs just to try to reach us. A few managed to fire off short bursts, but their shots always fell short. Then they'd stall and spiral back down." He went on to say, "Our gunners hardly ever had to fire. Altitude alone was better protection than any armor or weapon we had. It wasn't courage that decided those fights. It was technology." Japan wasn't the only nation struggling with that problem. Reports from Japanese military attachés stationed in Germany told of similar issues. Even the Luftwaffe, with its more advanced engines and aircraft, had trouble intercepting Allied bombers flying above 25,000 feet. Germany's new Me-262 jets managed some success thanks to their speed and high-altitude capability, but that kind of technology was out of Japan's reach. They understood the need for jet aircraft and even tried to copy German designs, But it was too late. They lacked the materials, the precision tools, and the industrial base to make it happen. The gap couldn't be closed, not with the resource shortages, not with the bombings that tore apart their factories, and not under the constant pressure of a collapsing war effort. The technological divide had become a chasm that no amount of bravery could bridge. Colonel John Montgomery, who commanded the 9th Bombardment Group flying from Tinian, remembered watching Japan's defenses evolve over time. "At first," he said, "they'd throw everything they had at us, big mass interceptions, whole squadrons climbing together, hoping sheer numbers could make a difference." By the spring of 1945, the Japanese had just about stopped trying to intercept us in daylight at high altitude. They threw everything they had into those efforts early on, sending up anything that could still fly, but by then, it just wasn't working. Eventually, they shifted tactics, focusing on night raids when our bombers came in lower. It was a smart adjustment, but it came far too late to make any real difference. For most of the campaign, we had the altitude advantage locked down. That alone allowed us to dismantle Japan's industry almost unopposed. Captain Hiroshi Fujiwara, a maintenance officer, wrote detailed reports after the war documenting the chronic problems Japanese fighters faced at high altitudes. He described how engine failures skyrocketed whenever pilots tried to reach maximum altitude. The L-40 engines used in the Ki-61s would overheat within minutes at full throttle once they climbed past 25,000 feet. Oil pressure dropped, coolant boiled, and even with radiator upgrades, the systems just couldn't cope. Oxygen systems were another nightmare. Pilots frequently blacked out at altitude, and some never regained consciousness. Frostbite was common too. Many men removed their gloves to handle frozen controls, only to pay the price moments later. Fujiwara concluded that no matter how determined the pilots were, those mechanical failures made sustained high-altitude operations practically impossible. Meanwhile, inside our B-29s, it was a completely different world. Staff Sergeant James Pearson, one of our flight engineers, recalled monitoring the pressurization system during missions. "The cabin stayed at about 8,000 feet, he said. Even while we cruised above 30,000, we could move around in our shirt sleeves, comfortable, focused, and ready to work." He paused, then added, "And all the while, the Japanese pilots were up there freezing, fighting failing engines and thin air. The mismatch was total. It wasn't a fair fight. Honestly, it was barely a fight at all." Corporal Shigo Yamamoto, a Japanese radar operator, remembered those same missions from the ground. "Our radar could track the bombers hundreds of miles out," he wrote. "We'd see them coming long before they reached our cities. We'd vector our fighters toward the intercept points, but it didn't matter. They just couldn't get high enough." He said the hardest part was listening to the pilots report back. They'd call in their maximum altitude, 27, maybe 28,000 feet. Then watch the bombers cruise by overhead at 31,000. You could hear the frustration in their voices. "We had the will," he said, "but not the means." In the end, Japan's final military assessments admitted what everyone already knew. Despite early warning systems, geographic advantages, and the legendary fighting spirit of their pilots, they simply couldn't defend against the B-29s. Their industry couldn't produce engines or aircraft that could compete. That recognition, the realization of total technological defeat, played a major role in the decision to accept surrender. Continuing the war wouldn't have saved the country. It would have only guaranteed its destruction from the air. One of the last attempts at interception came on August 14, 1945. Lieutenant Kuniohi Tanaka flew a Ki-100 on a mission to intercept an American reconnaissance B-29 that was photographing the damage from previous raids. He managed to climb to about 28,000 feet before losing engine power and having to descend, just another in a long line of failed climbs. The reconnaissance plane kept on climbing, unchallenged at 35,000 feet, calmly documenting the aftermath of the atomic bombings for U.S. intelligence. That flight symbolized everything about the war's final days. Japan's courage still intact, but its technology hopelessly outmatched. Even in the last hours of the conflict, they couldn't touch us. During our missions, we sometimes tuned into the Japanese fighter control frequencies. It gave us a direct window into their world and into their frustration. We could hear their ground controllers calling out vectors, altitudes, and headings, trying desperately to guide their fighters toward us. Then the pilots would come back over the airwaves, voices strained, reporting that they couldn't climb any higher. Engines overheating, power fading fast. Sometimes there was anger in their voices, other times just resignation. They knew exactly where we were and what we were doing, but they were powerless to stop it. In the end, technology decided everything. After the war, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey went over the numbers in detail. They analyzed every engagement, measuring just how effective Japan's fighters really were against our B-29s. The results were staggering. Throughout the entire campaign, high-altitude daylight missions suffered almost no losses from interception. Out of more than 30,000 sorties, only about 50 B-29s were lost to enemy fighters, a loss rate of less than 0.2%. Japanese aircraft only managed real success when we had to fly lower, usually because of mechanical issues or specific mission requirements. Statistically, it proved the concept of altitude sanctuary beyond question. At those heights, the enemy simply couldn't touch us. After the war, former Imperial Navy Commander Masatake Okumiya examined those failures in detail. The B-29's ceiling exceeded our estimates by at least 5,000 feet, he wrote. Our intelligence had predicted a maximum operating altitude of around 26,000 feet. Based on what we knew of the B-17 and B-24. When the Americans began flying routinely above 30,000 feet, our entire defensive strategy collapsed. He admitted that Japan never had the time, the resources, or the technology to develop any effective countermeasure. The sky had become an American stronghold. Colonel Robert Robbins, one of our B-29 pilots, remembered how that altitude superiority felt from the cockpit. Knowing the enemy fighters couldn't reach us changed everything, he said. We flew straight and level all the way to the target. No evasive maneuvers, no defensive panic. The bombardiers had steady platforms for perfect aim, and the rest of us could focus on keeping the machines running smoothly. The biggest threat was mechanical failure, not enemy fire. That kind of confidence, that sense of ownership over the sky, was incredible. Above 30,000 feet, we ruled absolutely. On the other side, Japanese fighter veteran Captain Yoshiro Aoki described what it felt like to look up and see those unreachable bombers. Every mission was the same, he said. We'd climb until our engines gave out, maybe reaching 1/3 of the altitude we needed. Then we'd just watch, helpless, as their silver contrails stretched across the sky. Our warrior spirit meant nothing against their engineering. We were samurai with swords trying to reach the moon. He admitted that the psychological toll was devastating. Worse than combat losses, watching an enemy dominate the air so completely shattered morale across entire squadrons. Even General Henry Hap Arnold, who oversaw the entire B-29 program, later reflected on what that victory meant. The aircraft had cost a fortune, more than the Manhattan Project itself, but the results justified every cent. The strategic bombing campaign, brutal as it was, proved that altitude, engineering, and industry could win wars just as surely as armies on the ground. Our investment in advanced technology had paid off. That altitude sanctuary, as we called it, allowed precision strikes and even the delivery of atomic weapons, all without suffering the kind of devastating losses that might have come from direct combat. We proved that technological superiority alone could decide a war, even without massive ground invasions. The time and money spent developing pressurization, turbo-supercharging, and advanced defensive systems reshaped military aviation for decades to come. After the war, Japanese aircraft designer Takeo Doi, the man behind the Ki-61, analyzed why their fighters had failed so completely against the B-29s. Our aircraft, he wrote, were built for battles between 15 and 25,000 feet, the altitudes where most aerial combat took place. None of us imagined bombers would operate routinely above 30,000. When they finally realized how high the B-29s could fly, it was already too late. Modifying existing fighters wasn't an option. Their engines, airframes, and entire systems simply couldn't handle that kind of altitude. Building a new design from scratch would have taken years, and Japan didn't have the time, the materials, or the industrial base to make it happen. Major Teruhiko Kobayashi, who led the 244th Sentai, achieved over 100 victories against American aircraft during the war, but barely scratched a single B-29. "My pilots were some of the most experienced men in Japan," he said. "They were aces, veterans of countless dogfights against fighters and medium bombers. But the B-29s, they might as well have been on another planet. Skill didn't matter when your aircraft couldn't even reach the enemy. We had the will, but not the means, to defend our homeland. Watching it burn from below was the worst kind of helplessness." On our side, Lieutenant Thomas Cartwright, a B-29 navigator, described how flying in a pressurized environment gave us enormous advantages. "We didn't need oxygen masks or thick gloves," he said. "We could chart our courses precisely, run calculations, use our instruments, and communicate clearly across the plane. We could move freely between stations, which meant teamwork stayed sharp." By contrast, Japanese pilots and navigators in unpressurized cockpits fought their own equipment. Frost covered their instruments, goggles fogged up, and the lack of oxygen made them sluggish and disoriented. "Our technology didn't just make us more comfortable," Cartwright explained. "It made us more effective in ways that went far beyond altitude." Colonel Hiroshi Yamamoto, who commanded Japan's anti-aircraft artillery defenses, summed up the futility from the ground. "Our biggest guns could theoretically reach 30,000 feet, he said, but accuracy at that range was almost impossible. The shell spread was so wide that hitting a single bomber took a miracle. We fired thousands of rounds for every aircraft destroyed, draining our ammunition stores with almost no effect." The B-29s, he admitted, were protected by altitude as effectively as by armor. And the problems didn't stop there. Maintenance became a nightmare for Japanese high-altitude fighters. Engines needed full overhauls after just a handful of maximum altitude missions. Superchargers failed regularly, and replacement parts were almost impossible to find. Oxygen systems constantly broke down, and there were never enough oxygen bottles or calcium hydroxide cartridges to scrub carbon dioxide from the air. Even when the planes weren't shot down, they were slowly worn out by the very act of trying to reach those altitudes. Combat losses didn't cripple Japan's air defenses. Mechanical attrition did. Each failed climb meant fewer planes could fly the next day. From the tail of our B-29, Sergeant Robert Goldsborough had the best view of it all. "I could see them coming," he said. "Tiny dots below, inching upward. Some would open fire from extreme range, but you could see their tracers curve and fall short. Others would push their engines to the limit in steep zoom climbs, hanging for a second at the top before stalling and tumbling away. I hardly ever had to fire my guns. They never got close enough to be a threat." The truth was, the technological mismatch extended far beyond just altitude. Our B-29s carried radar and radio navigation systems the Japanese couldn't even dream of. We coordinated formations across hundreds of miles, while their radios often failed mid-flight. We had heated flight suits, pressurized cabins, and advanced optical gun sights, all products of an industrial power unmatched anywhere else in the world. Japan tried to keep pace, mobilizing every factory and resource they had, but it was hopeless. Their production relied on small-scale, semi-handcrafted methods, what we'd call cottage industry. Meanwhile, our factories back home were running full assembly lines with precision tools, tight quality control, and the efficiency of true mass production. The difference showed in the numbers. By the end of the war, America had built nearly 4,000 B-29s. Japan, for all its effort, could barely produce a few hundred frontline fighters capable of facing them. Japan tried desperately to close the gap, but it was a losing battle. Even when they managed to capture bits of American equipment, They couldn't reproduce them. The problem wasn't intelligence or effort, it was materials. They simply didn't have access to the special alloys, synthetic compounds, or precision tools needed to build machines like ours. The industrial gap was too wide, and wartime shortages made it impossible to bridge. Lieutenant Commander Masahiko Kawamoto, who led special attack units against B-29 formations over Nagoya, remembered how hopeless it felt. "We changed tactics constantly," he said. "We tried everything. Night attacks, dawn interceptions, even coordinated ramming attempts. Nothing worked for long. The B-29s adapted faster than we could. If we figured out a night strategy, they'd switch back to daylight raids at altitudes we couldn't reach. They always stayed one step ahead. They had every advantage. We had only determination. And that determination couldn't overcome the engineering behind Boeing's design. The B-29 wasn't just another bomber. It was purpose-built for the Pacific Campaign, designed specifically to reach Japan from distant bases far beyond the range of enemy attacks. It could fly higher, farther, and longer than anything else in the sky. Its pressurized cabin made extreme altitude operations routine. Its superchargers gave it power where other engines gasped for air. Its defensive systems protected it without slowing it down. It wasn't so much an airplane as it was a flying weapons platform, a system engineered for supremacy. After the war, aviation engineers around the world studied it, and its influence spread fast. Pressurization became standard in commercial airliners, directly adapted from the B-29 systems. Turbo-supercharging led the way to the high-altitude jet age. The B-29's remote-controlled turrets evolved into the first generations of fly-by-wire controls. Those wartime breakthroughs shaped not just future bombers, but the entire modern aerospace industry. Captain Kazu Unoda, who commanded a Ki-84 squadron during Japan's final days, put it bluntly, "Our most advanced fighter meant nothing against the B-29s at altitude. Below 25,000 feet we could still fight and sometimes win. Above that we were helpless. Pilots would come back from missions without firing a single round. The psychological damage was worse than our losses." We knew the truth. Once you're beaten technologically, you're beaten completely. And that's exactly what the B-29 campaign proved. American air power validated the doctrine of technological superiority. Altitude sanctuary made it possible to dismantle Japan's entire military-industrial base without unbearable losses. Strategic bombing achieved what invasion might have cost millions of lives to accomplish. The success of atomic missions sealed that truth. The B-29's immunity from interception made those flights inevitable and unstoppable. The campaign showed that decisive air power didn't depend on mass or numbers. It depended on technology and industry. That realization laid the foundation for Cold War deterrence. Power through precision, not through attrition. Japan's military leaders saw it clearly by the end. Their inability to defend against the B-29s revealed something much larger, a technological inferiority that extended across every branch of their forces. Their factories couldn't match American production, especially under the constant pounding of bombing raids. That cumulative understanding, that there was no longer any way to stop the destruction, weighed heavily on Emperor Hirohito's final decision to accept unconditional surrender. Continuing the war would have meant nothing but more death and ashes. Resistance, by then, was only sacrifice without purpose. Chief Master Sergeant Frank Morrison, one of our maintenance chiefs, remembered it well. "The B-29 systems were complicated," he said, "but they worked. The pressurization equipment ran beautifully if you took care of it. The turbo-superchargers needed attention, sure, but they gave us power at altitudes where Japanese engines could barely breathe. Every piece of that airplane was the result of years of design, testing, and manufacturing. Things Japan just didn't have the capacity for. We won through technology and industrial might, not just bravery." On the other side, Lieutenant Jiro Tanaka, a Ki-61 pilot who survived several failed interception missions, described the toll it took. "Each climb felt like a battle with the air itself," he said. "Even with oxygen, breathing was hard. My hands went numb from the cold, my eyes watered constantly from the dry, thin air. And then I'd watch the bombers sail over, untouched, while our cities burned. It wasn't just defeat, it was heartbreak. We felt we'd failed our ancestors, our emperor, our people. Not from lack of will, but from lack of technology. In the end, American industry proved overwhelming. The sheer scale and sophistication of U.S. production were beyond anything Japan could imagine. The B-29 program alone cost more than Japan's entire military aviation budget combined. And it showed in every rivet, every engine, every mission. The B-29 program cost more than Japan's entire wartime aviation budget. For the whole war. That kind of investment created an advantage Japan could never hope to match. Mass production gave the United States economies of scale the Japanese industry simply couldn't achieve. Our factories ran with precision tools, skilled workers, and strict quality control, producing aircraft that performed consistently across thousands of units. Japan's hand-built methods couldn't compete with that kind of industrial rhythm. That imbalance, that industrial asymmetry, magnified our technological edge throughout the entire bombing campaign. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded the B-29 operations, pushed those advantages to the limit. His tactical innovations turned the Superfortress into a weapon unlike anything seen before. When high-altitude bombing lost efficiency, he switched tactics, ordering low-altitude night raids instead. Those missions gave up the altitude advantage but leaned into everything else we did better. Radar-guided bombing, precision navigation, and devastating incendiary payloads. Even without altitude on our side, technology remained our shield. The radar systems let us find targets through darkness and cloud cover. The massed formations of bombers, perfectly coordinated by radio, overwhelmed Japanese defenses regardless of how high or low we flew. That flexibility, the ability to adapt tactics while still maintaining a technological edge, was what truly made the difference. No matter how bravely the Japanese fought, they couldn't compensate for the imbalance in equipment, resources, and manufacturing power. Their pilots were skillful, their tactics inventive, but their machines simply couldn't keep up. The B-29 campaign changed the very meaning of air power. It proved that technology could achieve results once thought possible, only through massive ground invasions. It showed that industrial strength was just as vital to victory as battlefield strategy. Those lessons carried forward into the Cold War, shaping how nations planned their militaries for generations. In fact, the entire doctrine of nuclear deterrence, the idea that one side could guarantee victory or prevent war through overwhelming technological advantage, was built directly on what we learned flying over Japan. Looking back, the study of Japan's fighter operations against the B-29 raids makes one truth painfully clear. In modern warfare, technology isn't just an advantage, it's decisive. The Japanese pilots fought with astonishing courage. They improvised, they sacrificed, they flew against impossible odds. But no amount of bravery could overcome the fundamental reality of engineering and industry. The pressurized cabins, the turbo-superchargers, the precision manufacturing, those weren't just features. They were the difference between survival and destruction. That altitude sanctuary we lived in wasn't just a matter of feet or altitude. It was a symbol of how far technology had carried us and how far behind our enemies had fallen. When you add America's unmatched industrial capacity to that technological edge, the ability to mass-produce complex advanced weapon systems with precision and consistency, the gap became impossible for Japan to close. The B-29's overwhelming superiority in both performance and design vindicated every dollar and every hour invested in advanced aviation research. In the end, the war proved something new and undeniable. In modern combat, technology can outweigh even the most traditional military virtues. Courage, skill, and determination. Bravery alone couldn't reach 30,000 feet. The real battle wasn't fought only in the skies above Japan. It was also won in the factories, the drafting rooms, and the engineering offices back home, in the places where metal met math and ideas became machines. That marriage of science and industry set a precedent that would shape the future of air power for generations to come, defining not just how wars were fought, but how nations would prepare for them in the decades that followed.